My dear Daly, just a wee note to bid you goodbye. I expect in a few hours to join Tom and the other heroes in a better world. I have been sentenced to a soldier's death, to be shot tomorrow morning. I have nothing to say about this, only that I look on it as a part of the day's work. We die that the Irish nation may live. Our blood will re-baptise and reinvigorate the old land.
On Easter Monday 1916, a group of Irish men and women seized buildings across Dublin and proclaimed an Irish Republic. The 6-day armed rebellion against British rule was followed by the swift executions of its leaders. Ireland's 1916 Easter Rising would become a pivotal moment in the Irish struggle for independence, and its impact would echo 17,000 kilometres away on the other side of the world. Between 1851 and 1861, more than 100,000 Irish men and women emigrated to Australia. An indigenous culture was swept aside as the colonial discovery of gold transformed this ancient land. A destination once synonymous with chains was becoming a land of opportunity. Britain's colony at the foot of the world offered a generation of Irish the freedom to pursue a new life without the binding ties of class or constant political struggle.
There were different types of Irish immigrants to Australia. Obviously, the first lot who came were not at all voluntary in that they were convicts, and about a quarter of the convicts were of Irish birth. You're talking about 40 to 50,000 people, perhaps, who came as convicts. From the 1830s, you start getting free settlers who come. And a lot of them came from counties like Clare or Limerick or Tipperary. A lot came from the north, border counties like Fermanagh or Cavan or Armagh. Now, they weren't the poorest parts of Ireland. So you're getting mainly young people from rural backgrounds, getting assistance with their migration, but having some resources to help to pay what was a very expensive passage.
If you take somebody like John O'Shannessy, he was the second Premier of Victoria. He was Catholic. He arrived here in 1839 when this was still the Port Phillip district. And he arrived here really planning to try his hand at farming. He failed as a farmer, so he returned to his family business of drapery and set up a drapery store, and did so at a time where he could really profit from the huge influx of the gold rushes, and he became very wealthy. But he also became very successful as a politician. He was extraordinary in that he was elected the Premier of Victoria as the second Premier just a couple of years after self-government was granted. And he was probably one of the very first Catholics to hold that kind of office anywhere in the Empire since the short reign of James II.
The Irish who came to Australia were predominantly Catholic. By 1860, more than half the Catholics in Australian colonies had been born in Ireland, with a large proportion of the remainder being of Irish descent. Catholicism was the umbrella that the Irish sheltered under, offering an identity in this new land.
The Irish visual landscape was terribly important to have, for your community to have markers within the city, on the landscape, was a way of saying that you were established, you had a presence, you had a right to be here.
Well, St Patrick's Cathedral is the most dominant, obviously. Not many people realise this, but it's the largest Gothic cathedral to be completed in the 19th century. Its nearest rival is St Patrick's in New York, and when you think about that, that really is something to reflect on.
Now we look back on church building and think, why? Why did they do that? But at the time, it was really building a whole new community for a particular ethnic group.
So when the Catholic Church was being established in Australia, initially the British government authorities tried to get English Catholic clergy to man the church in Australia, but that largely failed. And what you found in Australia was a Catholic Church that emerged that was overwhelmingly populated by Irish clergy, both female and male.
As the Irish took advantage of the freedom afforded them in this new world, the historical baggage from the old world was difficult to leave behind.
The mistrust of the Irish Catholics goes back a very long way. You can really trace it back to medieval Ireland and the English arrival, conquest, where the Irish were seen as being different. They were seen as being not civilised because they didn't live the way that the English did. That carried on then to the 16th century and the Reformation, where the Irish stayed resolutely and apparently stubbornly Catholic. And in an Irish context, and therefore coming to Australia, was exacerbated by the terrible events of the 17th century in Ireland, where there were massacres and rebellions. Then the 1798 rebellion in Ireland that happened at about the same time the Australian colonies started to be formed. So the English and the Irish who arrived here came with all that.
You've got traditional enemies all having to learn how to cohabit in the one society. If you look at the local everyday world of people in urban colonial Australia, the Irish and English and Scots are neighbours for the first time. If they're immigrants, they're neighbours for the first time in their lives. The pub they go to is probably called the Rose, Shamrock and Thistle, and they're all drinking together, they're intermarrying and so forth. And of course, especially when it gets to election time or other moments of controversy, there were always the extreme voices, the extreme elements. How could there not be? This is hundreds of years of conflict.
At the beginning of the 20th century, Australia came together as one federated nation, placing Melbourne as its temporary capital. By this time, the city had become one of the great centres of Irish emigration. Many Irish moved to North and West Melbourne. Here, the meat markets, abattoirs and nearby wharves offered a ready work for the Irish. Melbourne was also home to the leaders of the Irish Australian community at this time, where an Irish Australian Catholic and Protestant middle class had burgeoned. A St. Patrick's Society formed in 1842, a St. Patrick's Day parade inaugurated in 1843, and a now demolished St. Patrick's Hall in Burke Street all spoke of a growing Irish Australian community that retained a strong identity with Ireland. In 1887, the Celtic Home Rule Club was formed, where the leaders of the Irish Australian community would meet and discuss the woes of Ireland. These Irish Australian leaders firmly believed in a parliamentary approach to solving Ireland's ills. In 1883, they would welcome the Irish politician John Redmond and his brother to Melbourne. Redmond was then leading the charge to deliver a form of self-government known as Home Rule to Ireland. This 10-month tour to Australia would raise the considerable amount of £15,000, the equivalent of nearly $2 million today, to support the Irish Home Rule cause. Irish Australia firmly believed a place could be found within the British Empire for Ireland.
The Irish who came to Australia in terms of politics, I think one would have to say their politics were fairly moderate. Not many of the Irish who came to Australia were famine refugees. Obvious reasons, because it was such a long way to come, it was so expensive to come. Most of those fleeing the famine went to the United States or indeed to Britain. That generated a lot of bitterness towards the British. And I think republicanism does thrive, particularly in the United States, among people who had suffered during the famine and among their children. Now, Australia didn't in the main have that sort of experience. So there's not a strong Republican movement in Australia. Most of the Irish Australians from the 1880s onwards essentially are supporters of Home Rule in terms of Irish politics.
The historian of Irish Australia, James Hogan, said, look, Melbourne was founded by Europeans in 1837. In 1851, 14 years later, we got Home Rule. We got our own self-government here under the British Crown. Ireland, a distinguished country for 2 millennia, for 800 years free, for 800 years under British rule, has not got Home Rule. What's going on?
The Australian colonies had gained self-government, parliaments of their own in the 1850s. And of course, by the 1880s, 1890s, they were heading for federation. And the Home Rulers in Australia felt that that's what Ireland was asking for. Ireland was asking for a measure of self-government. And they felt that the political unrest and discontent in Ireland that had plagued Ireland and created so many problems would be quietened, would disappear if Ireland was granted the sort of self-government that the Australian colonies enjoyed.
Here in Australia, and particularly in Melbourne with a very strong Irish community, there were public rallies to support the Home Rule movement. There was a rally in 1914 that attracted 45,000 people, and this is at a time when Melbourne's population is 600,000, so it's a substantial number of people gathering on the streets to support Home Rule.
The dream of Irish Australian Home Rulers to see Ireland obtain self-government within the British Empire was within their grasp. In 1912, after a long campaign, the Home Rule Bill giving Ireland self-government was passed. Opposition from Ulster Unionists who feared Home Rule would become Rome Rule had risen to a crescendo as both Protestants and Catholics in Ireland armed. But once it made its way through the British Parliament, Home Rule for Ireland was due to become a reality in 1914. But just as Irish Australian Home Rulers were celebrating, their lifetime commitment to realise self-government for Ireland would be placed on hold.
Up to mighty London came an Irish lad one day.
The outbreak of World War I in July of 1914 would change everything, as the British government suspended Home Rule for Ireland until after the war. As World War I suspended hopes for Irish self-government, it also catapulted Australia into this global conflict. The weight of history will be brought to the fore in this newly federated Australian nation.
Irish Catholics in Australia during World War I saw themselves mostly as being loyal. They appear to have enlisted in reasonable numbers. However, the Protestant press very much said that they didn't. They very much represented them as being disloyal, as not being able to contribute. Whereas Irish Catholics didn't see it as an either-or situation. They saw themselves as being able to be loyal to Australia and loyal to Ireland, and that may not necessarily have meant enlisting to fight in a war with Britain.
I think all the Protestant churches, without exception, were very fierce supporters of the war, very strong supporters, whereas the Catholic Church tended to equivocate a bit. Firstly, the Vatican remained neutral, and to the Protestants that showed immediately that the Catholic Church was not fully behind the war. And then some of the bishops equivocated over issues during the war. So Protestants immediately leapt on things like this as an indication that the Catholic community, the Irish Catholic community in Australia, was not fully committed to the war the way the British Protestant community was.
I do not grudge them. Lord, I do not grudge my 2 strong sons that I have seen go out to break their strength and die, they and a few, in bloody protest for a glorious thing. They shall be spoken of among their people. The generations shall remember them and call them blessed.
On Easter Monday 1916, over 1,000 Irish men and women, drawn from nationalist and socialist strands, led an armed insurrection on the streets of Dublin to end British rule. Impatient about the delays in implementing Home Rule and seeking to take advantage of Britain's preoccupation with the war, they hoped their act would inspire an entire nation to rise. Standing outside the General Post Office on Dublin's O'Connell Street, one of the leaders of the rising, Padraig Pearse, would read aloud the Irish proclamation declaring an Irish Republic.
Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland through us.
For 6 days, bitter street fighting engulfed the capital. But this poorly planned rising and the ill-prepared Irish volunteers were little match for the world's only superpower. Nearly 500 people would die, and on April 29th, at 3:30 p.m, Padraig Pearse would surrender to the British forces. Martial law would descend upon a Dublin left in smoking ruins.
Certainly there's a sense of the tragic hero flinging his life away in a sacrifice. And certainly the choice of Easter Sunday originally for the rising itself is not coincidental. The notions of sacrifice and of resurrection and rebirth that are redolent of Easter Sunday and its meaning in Christian tradition are exactly what the rising leaders were tapping into by scheduling their rising for that special day in the Christian calendar. And from that perspective, you can see that from the seeds of the rising were also its demise and a sense of the inevitability of death, but that also from that death would come rebirth.
To see it in terms of a war framework, I think makes it more explicable in many respects. Certainly in relation to the proclamation, it was a declaration of a republic. It was also indicating support for England's enemies, like that they were going to work with Germany. So in signing it, the 7 men who signed it kind of knew what they were doing, and in a way that this was a treasonous act. It was a threat to the monarch and a threat to the British Empire at its very core. This is the United Kingdom. So this isn't somewhere far away. This is somewhere that's, a day's travel, from London and the centre of power.
Australia was shocked and horrified by the news of Ireland's rebellion. The rising was vociferously condemned across the Australian press, in cables from the leaders of the Irish Australian community, and in the missives of the Irish Australian Catholic hierarchy. To an Australian establishment, the Easter Rising was a stab in the back to Britain proving Irish disloyalty. For the leaders of the Irish Australian community, who had followed Redmond in seeking home rule for Ireland, the Easter Rising was an act of madness that jeopardised all they had fought for.
Why were they so infuriated by this? And I think what was driving them was fear. And I think some people perhaps underestimate how serious the Easter Rising was. It went off admittedly half-cocked, but if it had gone off as was planned, and indeed if it had succeeded, it could have led to the defeat of Britain in the First World War. I think most people don't fully understand that. This was a rising that had German support. The Germans sent arms to arm the rebels. The original plan was for a rising of tens of thousands of people all around the country.
In Australia, the immediate impact seems to have been one of shock, as it was in Ireland itself and in the rest of Europe and Great Britain. But also a sense perhaps of frustration that this was an ill-timed rebellion, that Home Rule would still be pushed through. It had been postponed because of the outbreak of World War I. But from the Irish politicians like John Redmond and their associates here in Melbourne, there was a sense that Home Rule would come if everybody played nicely. And the rising was perceived as a disruption of this peaceful progress towards the home rule that Australia also enjoyed.
But the mood and political ground in Ireland and Australia would shift dramatically with the executions of the leaders of the Easter 1916 Rising in the days following. Every morning at 5 a.m, a volley of shots would ring out in the Stonebreakers Yard of Kilmainham Jail, Dublin, as leaders of the Rising were executed by firing squad. The swift court-martial and execution of these idealistic men bellowed the flames of Irish nationalism to create an independent Irish republic.
Politically, it perhaps wasn't the best thing to do if they'd been thinking of the political ramifications of this, but they followed through the kind of logic of what they'd done as an act of treason, and so they're shot. But what that does, in a sense, is it accords the rebels a particular status as soldiers of Ireland. And in a way, by shooting them, the British government concedes their point, concedes their argument, says you are soldiers of the nation, and therefore the nation exists.
The very flames that fanned Irish nationalism were also those that burnt the dreams of the leaders of an Irish-Australian community to create an Ireland, like Australia, within the British Empire. Ireland's 1916 rising would end both Irish Australia's belief in a parliamentary approach to Irish self-determination and the political careers of those who championed that approach.
They were so sure that Ireland would have its own Home Rule government in 1915 and their life's work would be realised. Now, of course, Ireland never got Home Rule. Their life's work was destroyed. A lot of these leaders of the Home Rule movement in Australia had sons who were killed fighting at Gallipoli on the Western Front, and they'd gone to fight, as had many of the sons of Home Rulers in Ireland, because they believed that by fighting for Britain in the First World War, they would guarantee Home Rule for Ireland. So not only had these men squandered their whole political lives, in many cases, and it was not an uncommon phenomenon, their sons' lives were sacrificed as well.
1916 witnessed the beginning of the end of an Irish-Australian community that believed Ireland had a place within the British Empire. A new Irish-Australian force was being forged in the embers of Ireland's 1916 rising by a man who would loom over Australian politics for over 50 years.
And to begin with, I knew nothing about Australia, except that it was at the wrong side of the equator and too near it.
Born in Cork in 1864, Daniel Mannix accelerated through the ecclesiastical ranks to become president of St Patrick's College, a seminary in Maynooth, Ireland. In 1913, he was appointed the coadjutor to the Archbishop of Melbourne. Mannix's particular experience was seen as useful in an Australia duelling over state funding for education. He arrived into Australia, which was still recovering from a devastating banking crisis, one that impacted across all levels of society. As the future Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne settled into his temporary community in West Melbourne, poverty and unrest lived deeply in this new nation. Prior to arriving in Australia, Daniel Mannix was a man with little Irish nationalist credentials. But the events of Ireland's 1916 rising and his experiences in Melbourne would create a divisive figure that would inspire both homage and loathing. The executions of the leaders of the 1916 rising was a defining moment in the life of Daniel Mannix, awakening a previously dormant Irish nationalism within him.
Early in the morning, when he had just heard the news from Ireland about the shootings, about the putting down, the shooting of the rebels, he broke the news to the handyman at St Mary's. With tears in his eyes, he said, "Michael, they've shot them." It does seem to me that that's a central event in the shaping of this extraordinary man. It was as if something was released in him with the news of the Easter Rising. The emotional force with which he responded to it suggests a real crisis within him. This cool, self-contained scholar becomes a romantic, as passionate as any of the rebels of that Easter Rising.
Initially cautious towards the rising, the execution of its leaders moved Daniel Mannix. From this moment, he would wade deeper into Australian political waters. Mannix would declare that the rising was a result of the British reaping what they sowed. Such comments from a public figure in wartime Australia proved incendiary. Mannix was linking the Irish question to World War I in a year in which Australia was questioning both its role in the war and its Australian identity.
The shock and the trauma of those executions galvanised Mannix, and perhaps today we would talk about it in terms of radicalisation. It radicalised Mannix and brought him to a new perspective on the struggle for Irish independence.
It's a fascinating thing. Here's one person whose horror and revulsion at that execution, and that was shared by lots of people, but he articulated it. I think that's the thing that he did. He spoke for many people, And I think we can't underestimate the fact that the power of his oratory actually gave rise to a force that became very much identified with him, and very much meant that to be Catholic in Australia meant that you were probably Irish. But now it's not just being Irish as in having an Irish accent or coming from Ireland. It's being Irish because you are as much committed to the Irish independence cause as you are to the Pope's cause.
As Mannix bound Irish nationalism and Catholicism together to forge a new Irish-Australian identity, Australia, in the midst of World War I, did not need this Irish-Australian question wrestling with its national soul.
Something shifts in the soul of the Australian nation. Something fundamental alters there, because now if you're a partisan Irish or a partisan Irish Catholic, how can you be part of a war that is designed to ensure the safety and prosperity of Britain? It's for the first time in Australian history, to be British and to be Irish were inherently contradictory things. For the Labor Party, who is in government, who is charged with the task of leading a nation in this war on the side of Britain, to be also the party with an overwhelming representation of Irish Catholics, there's no way through. Something's going to break, and it's probably the Australian Labor Party, and it's also probably the Australian society as well.
2 long years of fighting and thousands of Australian losses on the battlefields of Gallipoli, the Somme and Pozieres were forcing this nation to confront its role in the war.
At the Battle of Pozieres in the autumn of 1916, more Australians died in that first day than had died in battle since European settlement began. By 1916, you've got problems with war reportage, you've got censorship, but the scale of the loss is impossible to disguise. Typically, when a casualty was reported, a minister of the church would take the news round to the home of the person who'd died. As people with dog collars begin to knock on doors, people flinch.
Once the initial parts of the French campaign in Europe they were involved in from about May 1916, once the big terrible death rate started to come from there, which was even worse than Gallipoli, people lost interest in the war. They had huge difficulty enlisting people, which is why they had to talk about conscription.
Prime Minister Billy Hughes announced that he wanted to introduce conscription and that he would put it to a vote to the people, and for that he should be praised that he put it to the people, just a couple of months after the April 1916 Easter Rising. He could not have picked worse timing. William Butler Yeats wrote of the men of 1916, all changed utterly. That change can be seen in Australia, it can be seen in Melbourne, it can be seen in families, it can be seen in people's lives.
On the 30th of August 1916, 4 months after Ireland's Easter Rising, Prime Minister Billy Hughes announced a plebiscite on conscription, opening one of the bitterest chapters in Australian history. A newly radicalised Archbishop was quick to sketch out the questions this war and this plebiscite would pose for Australia.
I wanted to win the war. I wanted to promote voluntary enlistment, and I did not want conscription. I considered that the Australian people, the soldiers who freely enlisted, were doing it and doing very well. Australia's part in the war.
Such comments by Mannix on the doorstep of this vote on conscription brought the old question of Irish Catholic loyalty again to the fore. Yet his comments also tapped into a sentiment echoed in the party political halls of Australia. where the events of Ireland's 1916 Rising were stirring emotions.
For Australian Labor in 1916, this is a party that just 2 years before had been elected as the war was breaking out, been very strongly associated with the war effort, but was beginning to look back at it and really consider, for many in the movement, why is it that working people are disproportionately contributing to a war effort which they believed was actually benefiting the rich and powerful in Britain and not Australia and not the Australian working class. The execution of the leaders of the uprising in 1916 did have quite a significant impact on many of the Labor leaders in Australia. It was considered to represent old world militarism and old world values, as they used to say at the time, as against the new world values of sort of progressive democracy that many of these activists wanted to see. So it identified the military response in Ireland and the attempts to impose conscription in Australia as being part of the same project.
In October 1916, the conscription plebiscite was narrowly defeated by just over 70,000 votes. Prime Minister Hughes lamented to the British Prime Minister Lloyd George that the selfish vote, the shirker vote and the Irish vote had played their part. The defeat of the plebiscite would lead to an implosion in the Australian Labor Party, with the fiery Hughes leading a split to establish the Nationalist Party, leaving Australian Labor with a strongly Catholic core.
When Billy Hughes led his little band of supporters out of the caucus room and in the Labor split of 1916, I think there were 23 of them. Of those 23, 20 were Protestant. So that's like a very clear illustration of how sectarian, how ethnic, how ethno-religious this political split was.
But in the aftermath of the no vote in the 1916 plebiscite, this really shook many Australians. It seemed, could Australians be trusted with democracy? Here they were put to the test and they'd failed to do their duty, and people began to look for scapegoats. And clearly Mannix was an obvious scapegoat. And, by 1917, the term Sinn Féin is being used as a synonym for a disloyalist.
But after Easter 1916, and with the conscription debate, it's an entirely different political and social and cultural landscape that we're starting to see. Now, what the Irish Catholics are feeling is hostility from the rest of society. All of a sudden, the sort of mainstream Protestant Australia is turning on this ethnic and religious minority in a way that hasn't happened ever in Australian history, in the Irish Australian experience. And so what do you need? You need someone to come forward, highly combative, highly articulate, someone who's never going to take a backward step. Someone who's going to do battle for you. And that man was Daniel Mannix. And he was perfect for the part.
In 1917, Billy Hughes went to the polls with this new Win the War party and was returned to power. With Britain now seeking a 6th Australian division to fight in the war, Australia needed 7,000 men per month to fill this ask. The newly elected Prime Minister Hughes would soon announce a second plebiscite on conscription. The recently consecrated Archbishop of Melbourne, Daniel Mannix, and Prime Minister Hughes would now go head to head on this question facing the Australian people. In 1917, Hughes and Mannix would draw thousands of people, eager to hear them speak, as the case for and against conscription was presented. Mannix's duel with the Australian establishment delighted the majority of Irish Australian community. A fervent Irish nationalist and Catholic force was being created.
Sunday was the big day for Catholics. There was always something on, a bazaar, a fete, a foundation stone, and Mannix made them much more entertaining, much more dramatic, and gave them a new dimension of feeling when he used them not just to lay the foundation stone and say this is a worthy school or whatever it might be, but to begin to talk about something else, which in 1917 at any rate was very often conscription.
Every week he gave us, it wasn't a sermon, he never spoke in churches, he gave a speech at an opening or something, and it was a political speech, never talked on religion, and it was like a serial. Every week you got a new version, the next episode in this serial, and he talked to these massive crowds who came along because he entertained them, he was witty, and also because for the first time they had someone who, giving their own arguments, was winning the argument and beating the establishment and ridiculing them.
Hughes and Mannix, Prime Minister and Archbishop, really seemed to be made for each other because they were such contrasts in style. Mannix's way of dealing with Hughes was quite masterly, I think. Not to return the indignation that Hughes exploded into, but to say, as he said later, Mr. Hughes called me a liar and a traitor and a rebel. I always called him Mr. Maurice Hughes.
While this battle between Hughes and Mannix was heady stuff for most of the Irish Australian Catholic community, the events of Ireland's 1916 Rising were seeping into this bitter debate. A deepening sectarian divide in Australia was developing, which would leave a lasting legacy.
Critchley Parker was an Australian born of English parents. He was a writer and he edited and sometime owned a newspaper called the Australian Mining Standard. He funded publication of a series of pamphlets trying to expose what he saw as the pro-German elements of Australian society, and once he started looking at it, he also turned his sights on the Irish. He published article after article, pamphlet after pamphlet, demonstrating that the Irish weren't enlisting in the numbers that they should be, both in Australia and in Ireland, that they were disloyal and that they shouldn't be trusted at all. And Mannix came within his sights very, very clearly.
Throughout 1917, Hughes and Mannix slugged it out in this public battle over conscription. Mannix used this public stage to sharpen the focus on Australia's national identity and supporting role in this war. A month before the conscription vote, 60,000 people gathered at Richmond Racecourse to hear Archbishop Mannix speak on the issue. He stated that Australians should put Australia first and the Empire second when they came to consider the impact of the war. Such statements by Mannix and his much disputed later speech that World War I was an ordinary or sordid trade war, while inflaming Australian opinion, was finding ready ears in a nation growing weary of war.
I think Mannix's questioning of Australian loyalties and where they really lay was very timely, because I think a lot of people in Australia during the First World War began questioning, really, was this Australia's war? And when you saw the horrendous casualties, you find a large-scale peace movement develops in Australia, an anti-war movement, perhaps to be more specific. You find large elements of the Labor Party turn against the war. I think Mannix is giving voice to people who are starting to say, if we put Australia first, we shouldn't be fighting this war. This is not our war.
The organisers of the struggle against conscription were the Wobblies, the Women's Peace Army, the Labor Party, the trade unions. Mannix provided a voice from the other end of town, the top end of town, a person in authority, a rare thing in the whole campaign to get somebody from the other side to come out and support the working class struggle. Now, I think Mannix was influenced by seeing these spokespeople for the organised working class. When he said it was a trade war, he was repeating what had already been said in Labor Call and other Labor newspapers and at meetings.
In December 1917, the second conscription plebiscite was defeated, this time by a higher margin of nearly 170,000 votes. The bitterness of the conscription debates, fanned by an Irish political breeze, left an Australian society reeling and created a new political landscape as World War I came to a close.
Conscription was at bottom a class issue. In comes Mannix and is saying in effect, you cannot be Irish unless you're a Catholic, which shuts out all the Irish Protestants, many of whom supported Irish freedom and had risked their lives for Irish freedom and were strong nationalists. So that's number one blow. Number two blow is you've got to be Labor if you're Catholic. So one of my friends was recalling how her grandfather used to say, wretched Mannix, he ruined everything, because suddenly they're pushed by the church or feel obliged to support a side that they don't support because of their class position. And at the same time, it made Protestants feel that they were being taken over. They were losing their party.
The Australia that you find at the end of 1919 is one that is hopelessly divided on ethnic lines, class lines, sectarian lines, you name it. It's completely unrecognisable to the one that had entered the war, and that would take 3, 4, up to 5 decades to heal. The Irish sectarian divide, the divide between Protestant Australia and Catholic Australia, would not heal in a real sense until the 1960s and the 1970s at the earliest.
Society divided into Catholic Victoria and Protestant Victoria, and you could pass through institutions from birth to your grave, which were never crossing the threshold of the other side's institutions. So there's not a lot of open violence or hostility, but there's a lot of silent nastiness. You know, that black Protestant shall never darken my doorstep if you're going to marry him, etc., or that perfidious Catholic Irish will never come into this house. That was part of many families' experience.
Now, the Australian Labor Party was almost reduced to an Irish Catholic socialist romp. It had gone into the war owning the political space of Australia. Now it had gone hard left, and it was identifying itself almost solely as an Irish Catholic political force.
The 1920 St. Patrick's Day parade in Melbourne was the most visible evidence of the impact of Ireland's 1916 Rising on Irish Australia. Just 6 years prior, thousands of Irish Australians had demanded self-government for Ireland within the British Empire. Now, in 1920, 100,000 people lined the streets in support for Irish independence. 20,000 Irish Australians, including returned soldiers, took part in the parade, led by Archbishop Mannix, who was flanked by 14 Victoria Cross winners mounted on white chargers. A statement of Irish Australian Catholic loyalty to both Australia and to Ireland's efforts to secure independence was being made.
The 1920s St. Patrick's Day parade was a huge statement of the twin loyalties that Daniel Mannix actually inspired. His first loyalty is to the church, and this is an Irish church by now. It's very much identified with him, but he's also making a statement about the loyalty of the Catholic community to Australia. And as a piece of pure theatre, it was absolutely staggering. It was really a magnificent spectacle.
The 1920 St. Patrick's Day parade is a very strong declaration of how powerful the support in Australia is, including amongst returned soldiers, for the cause of Irish independence, at a time when it's being worked out in arms.
But what Mannix has created is a new self-confident Irish Catholic political and public and religious force in Australia, which continues.
And he wanted Catholics to stand proud, declaring the Catholicism, marching down the street on St. Patrick's Day, all the school children in their uniforms, all the sodalities, all the groups, to proclaim that this was Irish Catholic Australia, and we are here, we are strong, we are fantastic.
No longer did Irish Australia see a place for Ireland within the British Empire. A more strident Catholic and pro-Labour force, keen to take its position in Australian society, with a charismatic leader at its head, was born in the embers of Ireland's 1916 Rising.